everyone, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time seeing me, hi, I'm Bree and I am super happy to have you here. So today's video is my very first coding tutorial and I am so excited to be coding with you all today. So what are we going to be coding? I have created a tutorial for the game of Mad Libs. If you have never heard of it before, Mad Libs is a story, and basically this story has some holes in it. This story has removed different words, and it is the player's job to fill in those blanks with the different parts of speech to create a funny and wacky and zany story. This is a game I played a lot as a kid because it's a very good way to figure out what your different parts of speech are, but I think this also could be super fun for adults too. If you think about it, like Apples and Apples was a game that was technically created for kids where you are finishing sentences with funny words, and now we have Cards Against Humanity, so the world is honestly your oyster. So this tutorial is going to show you how to create the Mad Libs app, and it is going to be using vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so we won't be using any libraries today. If you're a beginner, this is a really great project for you because it will help you practice using forms in HTML and obtaining and manipulating that form data with JavaScript. So before we get started, I want to run down some of the resources that I have included in the description that will be super beneficial to you if you're going to be coding along with me today. So in the description, what you'll find is a link to the Github repo that is housing this Mad Libs project. You will also find a link to a live demo where you can play around a little bit with the Mad Libs app itself if you want to, play around and see what it does before we actually start coding. There's also going to be a link to the wiki that I wrote with every single instruction that's going to be in this video, just in case you want to tackle it on your own, or if you're more of a person who likes to read and see things written out, use those two resources together to create the project. And then there's going to be links to all of the resources that I used. What you'll find is I used the free resources to help me out a little bit with CSS, so that way I didn't have to come up with everything on my own. But of course, I want to credit all of the creators and designers who have created the resources so that I could use them. So I'm so excited to share this project, and I worked on it for quite a long time, but I really want to know from you guys, is this something that you like? What can I change? What can I do to make this better? Because I would love to start making tutorials and I want them to be as helpful as possible as they can for y'all. Don't be too harsh on me because it is my first one, but I would love some feedback. So without further ado, let's get coding. The first thing I want to do before we actually get into the tutorial portion of the video is talk about what Mad Libs is and what it is actually going to do. So Mad Libs is a really simple game, like I talked about a few seconds ago, where users basically have the option to input different parts of speech into our little form, and from the different parts of speech that they have given us, we are going to go ahead and create a funky and spunky crazy story that goes with the words that they gave us. So really here, all we have is a basic form made with HTML, and we have a button. And this form is going to be used to help us fill in the parts of our story, and the button is going to be used to generate the story. Now, when that button is clicked, you'll see that the actual form itself goes away, and we show the generated story in that spot. And then instead of a generate button, we have a play again button. So not a lot of controls here, really just an HTML form, a button that we're going to use to transform our play area into a paragraph of text. And then from there, we're going to give users the option to start again. One thing I also do want to point out is in the completed story, we have added special styling, or we will add special styling to the words that the user has input. That way they know exactly what they input and contributed to the story. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up our project. This project is only going to use vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so we won't need any external libraries or anything like that to loop in. So the setup is going to be pretty simple. I just created a madlibs.html, a madlibs.css, and a madlibs.js all in the same directory. And of course, our HTML file is going to be used for the structure, the CSS file is going to be used for the styling, and the JavaScript file is going to be used to add additional functionality. So I want to go ahead and get everything all linked together. So the first thing I'm going to do in my HTML document is get an HTML5 boilerplate going. That way it just has all of the code that we need and we don't have to do any of the guesswork. So there's a few options here. If you memorized it, that's great. You can go ahead and input it here, but I know that I sure haven't. One of the helpful tricks I use is if you have Emmet, the extension, installed on any of your coding environments, what you can do is type HTML:5, and that will go ahead and bring up the boilerplate code for HTML5 up for you with very little typing. Or if you would like to rather copy and paste it, you can do that as well. You can do a really quick Google search for the HTML5 boilerplate code, and you'll be able to find it. So after we have our boilerplate code all set, the first thing I'm going to do is go in and change the title for the document. And I'm a little extra, so I added a few emojis as well, just to give some wintertime flair to our Mad Libs. Next, what we're going to do is we want to link our style sheet and our JavaScript file all together so that our project is all connected. Now I'm going to start with the CSS. So what I'm going to do is add a link tag inside of the head of the document, and I am going to make the rel for that style sheet and link it to the local address of this file that I've created for madlibs.css. Then after that, what I'm going to do is go to the bottom of my body and use the script tag to go ahead and link my JavaScript file as well. After these two files are connected, I just want to be absolutely sure that everything is up and working like it's supposed to. This is something that I started when I first was learning how to code, and it's just something that has stuck with me. So what I do is go ahead and I add one very, very simple style to my CSS, and usually it is to turn the background color blue because it's very easy to see. And I go to my JavaScript file and I create a very simple alert, and then I'm going to go ahead and view my HTML document in the browser. Now what should happen if everything's connected properly is the background of the document should be blue, and I should get an alert with my little message saying we're all in business as soon as I open the file. Now that everything has been connected, we can start working on the actual content of our page. So I also do want to go ahead and make a really quick note because I always forget this. If you do what I did a few seconds ago where you changed the color of your background and added a little alert message to your JavaScript file, just make sure that you go ahead and remove those. I always forget, so I just wanted to go ahead and put that in there. So let's go ahead and get started with our content by creating a header. So I'm thinking that since Mad Libs is pretty generic in its functionality, we can create a header that tells our users exactly what Mad Libs is, and maybe also give it a subheading of whatever our story name is. So I'm going to be giving this document an H1 with our Wintertime Mad Libs title, and then the subtitle, or our H2, is going to be the story name that we're going to be allowing our users to create. And in this case, it is fun facts about winter, but of course, please feel free to pick any story that you found online or even create your own. So in a paragraph section a little bit below this, what I want to do is just give users an exact overview or exact directions on what they're going to be doing. And really, again, Mad Libs is pretty simple, so I'm just letting users know that they just have to fill out the blanks, and we're going to go ahead and generate a story for them. At this point, we have a very bare bones app where we can see all of our plain text and our title and our subtitle and description. So let's work on giving it a little bit of style. The first thing I want to style is the background because it's easily like the biggest thing you can see on the page so far. And I'm thinking that I want to give our background a nice gradient. So I am not amazing with creating gradients, and you don't have to feel like you need to be an expert either, because there are lots of tools and websites where designers have graciously uploaded their work so that we as developers can go ahead and use it. So today I'm going to be using egggradients.com, where I found a nice blue gradient that I would like to use. And the good thing is I don't have to write any code for it. I'm really just copying the CSS that they gave and plopping that right into a body rule that we're going to create in our CSS. So now that we've added the body rule and we have added the gradient, once we go back over to the document in the browser, we can see that it's not exactly what we're looking for. It looks like the gradient is repeating at the size of our header. So what we want to do is we want to tell the gradient that it should span the whole page, not just the height of our header. So in order to do that, we are going to add a rule that targets our HTML. And what we're going to do is set the height to 100%. This way it's going to take up 100% of the page. And now when we recheck everything, it looks like it's all fixed. The next thing I want to do is add a Google font. I know that there's probably a lot of people who love Times New Roman, but I would like to shake things up a little bit, and we are not just limited to whatever fonts are installed on our computers. So Google has fonts they offer for free, and just like Egg Gradients, they also give you the exact import statements that you need to go ahead and link them to your project. So they have a ton of fonts, and today I'm going to be choosing Poppins because it's just a font that I default to fairly often. But what I'm going to do is head over to fonts.google.com, and I am going to select the different font weights that I want to include in my bundle. And for this purpose, I'm only going to include 400, which is going to be the normal weight, and 700, which is going to be the bold value. Just so you know, if you want to include more weights, it might slow down the CDN and it might take a little bit longer for those fonts to pop up. So it's just something that you should consider when you're trying to determine which font weights you're actually going to use and you want to import. So after I have those import statements, what I'm going to do is head over to my HTML, and I'm going to paste these import statements to link for the fonts in between my metadata and in between my title in the head. So we want these to be above the style sheet links so that we can go ahead and have our style sheet pick up this import when we do the next step, which is head over to our CSS and define the font family for the body as Poppins. And as a backup, we're going to say, if you can't find Poppins for whatever reason, go ahead and select a sans serif font. Now, when we head back over to the browser, things look fairly the same, but we don't have that funny looking Times New Roman anymore. We have our nice Poppins font. The next thing I want to do is add sort of a glassy or frosted effect to our board. Currently, our background is blue, and I want the board that the users are going to be playing on and the form is going to be housed in to stand out a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is restructure my HTML just a little bit. What I'm going to do is encase our header and basically the main that we will have soon inside of a div, and I'm going to call that div or give it a class of container. And then I'm going to head over to our CSS, and I'm going to achieve this frosted effect by giving this container a background color that is basically white and has an opacity of 60%. So if we jump back over to the browser, we can see that it looks good. It is frosted, but there are a few updates that we could make to make this look even better. So I'm going to start off with updates by giving this a little bit of padding, and I'm going to add a border radius to it as well, just because I think rounded borders are nice, and I think it goes very well with this frosted effect that I'm trying to achieve. And something else that's really going to make this stand out and give it more dimension is a shadow. So box shadows are something like gradients, where they can be a little bit tricky if you haven't really had a lot of time to play around with them, or even if you have, you might not want to sit there and figure out how to get the exact shadow that you're looking for. So this resource is called getcssscan.com, and they have a section for CSS box shadows, and I found one that I liked and I thought gave this page a lot of dimension. So all I have to do is copy this box shadow and add it to my CSS. So one thing I want to note, since I know that I have been using a few different resources, something that I didn't know as a software engineer is that it is completely okay to look up things and like reuse the code. And that's why I've left it in this tutorial. There are going to be times where you have to look things up either on like Stack Overflow or one of these resources maybe, and you reuse code that's already been created. And I just want to let you know that that's absolutely okay to do, and there's nothing wrong with it. So if we head back over to the browser after adding this box shadow, we can see that it looks really nice and things are really starting to come together and take shape, which is exciting. So after I add this box shadow, I can see that things are still kind of long. They're out of shape a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and head back over to my code and just place a few restrictions on the width and the height. So I am going to be placing a min width and max width and min height and max height. And these are going to be in the units of measure called view width and view height. Basically, this is just going to say, no matter what device you're on or what screen size you're on, I don't want the game board to take up more than 70% of the view width, but it should take up at least 60% of the view width. And the same thing for the view height. And then I'm going to center things in the middle by adding a margin, and I can do this by adding margin 0 auto. So things are currently looking really good, but I do want to make one more change, and this will be the last styling change that we make for now. I want to center this container in the middle of the screen so that it doesn't just stay at the top. There are lots of ways to do this, but I'm going to do this by adding flex to the parent of our container class. In this case, that's the body. And I'm telling it to align item center. This is going to vertically align any child elements of body. So I do want to note, because it can look kind of funky, I want to note that I added a rule here for height because the flex will vertically center the child elements based on the height of its content, but we want this content to be the whole page. So we want to tell that parent that it should be spanning 100% of the page to increase the height of the container. But then what happens is we get a scroll bar on the side, and that's not really the style that we want. So I am going to tell our container to set the overflow of Y to be hidden. And if there is a scroll, I want it to be in the game board container itself and not within our parent HTML where the gradient is. So this is going to be checkpoint 1. At this point, what we've done is create the main structure and files for our Mad Libs game. We have created the initial styles, and we have ensured that everything is connected. So now we can move on to creating the actual Mad Libs form and the play area. So now that our structure and setup is basically complete, we are going to enter what I am thinking of as the second phase of our project. And that is really going to be creating the Mad Libs form itself. So what we want to do first is create the Mad Libs play area, and it's really just going to be composed of a single form. So the form is going to be composed of however many inputs your story has. So in my instance, this story has 12 fill in the blank areas for users. So that means that my form is going to contain 12 different form elements for users to fill in. So I found a really cute little story online, but of course you can also go ahead and create your own if you are creative and would like to. So let's get started by creating the structure for the play area. So we always want to make sure that we are using semantic HTML. So before we even get started with our form tag, let's go ahead and add a main under our header. This is going to tell the browser where the main bulk of our content is. So let's get started by using main, and inside of that main, what we're going to do is add our form. And what we're going to do inside of that main is add our form. And we want to make sure that we're giving our form an ID and a name. Typically, I keep these the same. I want to take a second and think about the structure of our form. As we saw in the demo, after we have our input text, we have the submit button to generate the story. But what happens is the input text goes away, or the input text boxes go away rather, and our story shows, and that generate button turns into a play again button. One little piece of setup that we can do now to help us later is to break up this form into two elements. So the first section that we can create is to hold our inputs, and the next section that we can create is to hold the submit button. So let's do that now. We can do that by creating two sections with the section tag, and we're going to differentiate them by giving them distinct IDs. So one is going to be Mad Libs inputs, and one is going to be Mad Libs submit. Now that we have our section set up, it's time to actually go about adding the form elements themselves. So For Mad Libs, this is a word game, so all of our inputs are going to be using the type text, even if they're numbers, mainly because we want to give our users the option to either type out the number or to go ahead and use the number itself. Either way, it'll show up and make sense in the context of the story. Something that would probably be helpful is having a list of the inputs that you're going to need right next to you or somewhere in your coding environment where you can easily access them. That way you don't get confused, because typically each story is going to have repeats of the parts of speech. So you're going to want to keep track of exactly how many nouns there are, how many adjectives there are, and so on and so forth. And this is going to require us to have very good naming conventions for all of our inputs. So in order to go along with good naming conventions and making sure that everything is properly labeled, we want to have a label for each one of our inputs. So you can think of this almost as a label and input pair. So let's take a look at a label. The first thing we're going to do is create the label itself and give it text that we want it to read out, and then we're also going to give it the for attribute. Now this for attribute is going to be linked to the ID on the input element that we are pairing this label with. So it's important for these two values to match. When we add the input element, we are going to give it an attribute of type text. We're going to make sure that the ID is equal to the for attribute on our label, and we're going to give it a name as well. Typically, I like to make this the ID or whatever text is in the ID, just because it makes things a little bit easier. And the last thing that I'm going to do is actually surround both of these label and input pairs inside of a div. And this is really just going to help us a little bit down the road when we want to do some styling. So something I also want to mention is that I have added the required attribute on the input. And this is because we don't want people to be able to submit their Mad Libs form without completing certain fields, because they won't have a full story. So by adding the required attribute, we are telling the submit button on the form to go back and double check and make sure that all fields are entered and that everything has a value. And if not, the form is going to check to see where the first instance of an input not being completed is and direct the users to that. So this is a little bit of a game of copying and pasting, and it might take a second, but do your due diligence and make sure that everything is named properly, because it'll make adding functionality in our JavaScript so much easier. So I'm going to go ahead and add in the rest of my fields now. So after we're done adding in all of our fields, let's hop over to the browser and see what we can see. What we should see, and what I do see, is that we have all of our labels and all of our inputs together. And I did go ahead and add a few emojis because I thought it would add just a little bit of flair. The last thing our initial form needs is a submit button. So we're going to do that by using the Mad Libs submit section right below our Mad Libs inputs, and we are going to add a button with the type submit. And I am choosing to call our button generate. So now when we head over to the browser, you should be excited because we have 99% of the inputs that we need to start using Mad Libs. So before we tackle some of the functionality, I want to take just a second to do a little bit of styling. So let's give this form a little bit of a facelift. The first thing I want to do is add a little bit of padding and a little bit of a margin to the form sections to give them a little bit more space, and so they're not just all clustered together. The first thing I'm going to do is target the form and section in our CSS, and I am going to provide a padding of 0 on top and bottom, and then 5% on the sides. And then I'm just going to add a little margin to the top of 20 pixels, just so our inputs are not flush with our description and our header. The next thing I'm going to do is use flex properties so that my inputs and the labels can be stacked on top of each other. And then I also want them to flow from left to right in a column so that our form looks just a little bit nicer. So let's tackle this in two parts. So the first thing I'm going to do is use Flex to have my labels stack on top of my inputs. And I'm going to do this by utilizing some of the work that we already put down, which was the input group class that we added to those label and input pairs. So let's go ahead and target that input group class. And what we're going to do is give it a display of flex, change the flex direction to column, and then we're just going to add a little bit of margin to it as well. Now we can see that the labels are stacked on top of the inputs, which is exactly what we want. Now this looks really good, but I want to give my inputs a little bit of pizzazz. So I'm going to add a little bit of styling to make them look taller, wider, and add a border radius, and of course add a little dimension by giving them some box shadows. But instead of them going down in a super long list, it would look better and be a lot easier if these were in a column almost, or rows of columns. So we're going to do this by sort of going a little bit backwards, and what we're going to do is go back to our form section where we initially added padding, and what we're going to do is also give this selection a display of flex. Now what we're going to tell this selection is that we want these items to be in a row and we want them to wrap. Now I want to take a step away from styling for just a moment to connect our submit button and our form and connect it to our JavaScript. So let's get started by connecting our submit button to our form in our HTML. So the first thing that we need to do is head over to our HTML, and we are going to be updating our form element. And we are going to be adding the attribute on submit, which is going to tell our form exactly what to do and which function to run when our form is submitted. And that submit button is connected to our button with the type submit at the bottom of the form. So we're going to pass it a function, and I'm just going to call it submit Mad Libs, and I'm also going to pass an event because it is going to have our click handler and all of the information about the event that occurred when the user clicked generate. So now let's head over to our madlibs.js and actually create the submit madlibs function. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a very simple function just to make sure that everything is connected and working properly. And I'm going to do this by declaring the submit madlibs function just like we had in our HTML, and I'm just going to give it a simple alert of hey. So now when we head back over to our form in the browser, once we fill everything out, which is required because all of our inputs have required, and we hit generate, you might find that our form does say hey, and then it looks like it almost refreshes. And then if we take a look at the address bar, if you look closely, these are actually our form inputs that we use to go ahead and test. And that's not exactly what we want. So let's head back over to our function and see what we can do. What we're going to do in our submit madlibs function under our alert of hey is add event.prevent default. And this is going to prevent the page from refreshing and from sort of kicking out all of our inputs when the generate button is clicked. So after we add this one line, let's go back over to the browser again and input all of your test madlibs, and when we hit generate this time, we see that all of our inputs are still there, and we don't have the inputs that we had in the address bar of the browser, which is exactly what we want. This far, we have created our Mad Libs playing board with the inputs, and we have styled them, and we have also created the submit function that we are going to use very soon in order to generate the actual Mad Lib story itself. Okay, so now we are entering phase 3, which is all about creating the function that's going to be used to submit the Mad Libs, and it is all about story generation. So this is going to be the third and final phase, and this is where a lot of the magic starts to happen. So when a user submits a Mad Libs form, there are two things that we really need to do. The first thing is to extract their answers, and then we need to combine their answers with the shell of the story to create a full story. So let's get started by extracting the data. So the first thing that we want to do is create an object that we can use to store our form data. And if you look at how we've set up our HTML, we've created inputs that will be perfect for creating unique key value pairs for when we need to fill in the blanks of our story. And in order to do this, we are going to be utilizing form data, which is a built-in API that allows us to easily construct key value pairs from our form data. So let's create a new form data object and tell it where our form is. In this case, our Mad Lib submit function will be only triggered by the form submit, so we can always be guaranteed that the event target for this function will lead to our form. So we want the key value pairs from our form, so then we're going to use object.fromEntries to set this to a variable, which is going to give us all of the data from our form. Now let's add a really quick console log right under that logic that we just created so that we can see what our user submission actually looks like. If you head over to the developer tools of your browser, you'll be able to see that we get an object-like structure that has the exact key value pairs that I was talking about just a few seconds ago. So this is really why having good naming conventions for all of your form inputs is so important, because this is the exact input that we're going to use in the next step to actually format our story. When it comes to generating the story, if you don't want to worry about styling, it's actually fairly easy. All you have to do is use a template string and use the shell of your story to combine the key value pairs that we have from the object that we created and combine them with the spaces in the story where the holes need to be filled. But I want to make our Mad Libs fancy, of course, so I'm going to do this by composing HTML that we are going to insert into our JavaScript. And I'm doing this for two reasons. The first reason is I am going to be adding styling to the words that are inserted, and the easiest way to do this is to create a span around those words where I can attach a class to it. So it's going to be really helpful to add that class and the span element around the words as we compose that HTML for our story and inject it via JavaScript. And the second reason I want to do this is because encasing the story block in a variable, by doing this we are setting up ourselves for some logic that we are going to implement later, which will be to remove the text inputs that we have when we are showing our Mad Libs form to show the story once it's been completed, and then remove the story again if the user would like to play again and show the Mad Libs form. So honestly, I found it to be the easiest to work in a basic text editor, which as you can see is what I am doing now. And the first thing I did is I started by just typing out or copying and pasting the story, and I pasted it with a specific text that I use to notate the inputs. And I like using this really basic text editor because I can just find and replace everything that I need to. So basically what I'm doing is I have written out the story itself. After I did that, I encased the entire story in a paragraph tag because that paragraph is what we're going to be using to inject into our HTML with JavaScript. And then after that, instead of going through each individual one, I sort of did a find and replace. And what I am doing here is I want to replace that brackets input with the notation to use the object that we created and have those keys be placed in our story so that we can just pull in the values when it's rendered. So there is special notation in order to do this, and I just want to let you know now, and I'll let you know in a few seconds too. In order to use a template string, we have to use backticks, and that is the key that is on the left side of the one. We can't just use the single quotes and double quotes for this because it won't work. So when I'm adding my user submission, I am just replacing the input text that I have there with a $, an opening curly brace, And then we are directly calling or directly targeting the user submission object. And then from there, you can use it just like you would a normal object. So you can use, for instance, .number, if that was what I was trying to access, to obtain the value. And then after you have the value you're looking for, we're going to go ahead and close it with a curly brace. So something I have also done is I have wrapped all of my inputs inside of a span, and I have added the class inserted text because we, again, are going to set ourselves up for a little bit of logic that we will implement later, which is to style the inserted text. That way our users can very easily see the text that they input. And after we do all of this, it is a great time to double check and make sure that your story is correct and that you have the amount of inputs that you need. So after our story is created, what we're going to do is just add a very short H3 tag at the very top that says your completed story. That way the users know that the story that's being shown or the text that's on the page is the story that they actually created. So after we have composed our story and added our little H3 to the top, what we're going to do is transfer this over to our JavaScript. Now, typically, if you might have forgotten a closing brace like I did, this is a good spot to figure it out because you can go through and see where the linter is telling you that there's problems, and you can go ahead and fix them quickly. But once we get this into a variable, and I'm calling the variable story, what we're going to do is add a console log, and we are going to once again go back over to the browser and test. And what we're looking for this time is not necessarily a change in our document itself, but it's more so in the console. So what you should find is when you input all of your fields, you should see our story, which will have some HTML, but instead of having our user submission dot, for instance, number or adjective, you should see the actual data that you input, which is super cool because it means that we are one step closer to completing our story. So now that we have figured out how to retrieve our user data, and we have completed the story, and we have the user inputs in the story, we can now work on showing and hiding the Mad Libs form and the completed story. So we want these two to toggle. So they shouldn't be on the screen at the same time. And in order to make this happen, we're just going to use a CSS class that is going to set the display to none. But first, what we need to do is just a little bit of restructuring within our HTML. So if we open up our Mad Libs HTML file, we don't want the form and our completed story to show at the same time. So we're going to create a section underneath of our form. That way one is not inside of the other. And what we're going to do is create this section and give it an ID of completed story. And by default, when the user comes to the page to fill out the Mad Libs form, we don't want this section to be showing. So we are going to give this section a class of hide by default. Then we're going to hop over to our CSS and just write up this really quick class. So the hide class is going to have just one style in it, and it is going to be to set the display to none. Once we save this and head over to the browser to check, we shouldn't see any visual changes, but what we should be able to see is in the developer tools, if you select the form and then look under it a little bit, we should still be able to see that our section is there in the HTML. It's just hidden for the moment because of that hide class. So we have our empty story section, and we can see it in the developer tools when we take a look at the structure of our HTML, but how do we get our story into that section? Well, because of the way that we structured our story by wiring it up with HTML and using the spans for the inserted text, we've actually made this very easy for ourselves. What we can do is just insert that story string as it is into our HTML. So in order to do that, what we need to do is target our section first. So in our madlibs.js, what we're going to do is target and store our completed story section, and we're going to do this by using document.getElementById, and we're going to use that ID of the section, which is completed story. Once we've done that, we can go back down to our submit Mad Libs function, and what we can do under the story variable, we can tell our story section.innerHTML to equal itself plus whatever our story is. So in this case, the story section doesn't have anything in it right now. That's the whole point. It's empty. So what we're really just doing is we are only adding the content of our story to this section. And we're doing it by updating the inner HTML for the section. So now let's take a look in the browser. After you have completed the form and submitted it, again, no visual changes, but what you should notice is that the completed story section is now no longer empty. You should see the HTML there, and you should see your inputs there as well. So we can see it in the console, but we want to be able to see it on the screen. So how can we do this? Well, a few minutes ago when we created this section element, we gave it the class of hide because we didn't want it to be there initially until the user has filled out the form. So what we can do is again target our story section and then target the class lists that are included for this section, and we can just remove the class that we don't want to be there anymore. So in this case, we're going to use story section.classlist.remove, and we are going to pass hide into that remove function to tell the class list that we don't want that hide function to be there anymore. And after we do that, if you fill out the form again, I know this is a lot of filling out the form just to test things and see how things are working, but when you do it this time, you should see that your story actually generates on the page, and it generates as it should in just text. No HTML elements or anything like that in there. And if you do see some rogue HTML elements, you might want to check to make sure that all of the tags that you're using have opening and closing tags. But this is an amazing step because this means that we have actually generated a Mad Lib, and if you weren't worried about styling or hiding and showing things like I am, this would be a great point to be like, oh, you've completed the project, you have made a full app, you have accepted user input, and you have shown your generated story to the user. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to worry about the toggling next. Now we can see our completed story, but we want to remove the Mad Libs form because we want them to toggle. They shouldn't both be on the page at the same time. So we basically have already figured out how to do this. We just have to do the opposite of what we did for our completed story section. So if we head back over to our madlibs.js, at the very top of the file, just like where we targeted our completed story section, we're going to do the same exact thing for our Mad Libs form. So we can use the same logic to target that Mad Libs form with the document.getElementById, and we're going to use Mad Libs form. So this time, instead of removing a class list, we actually want to add the hide class to this item's class list because we don't want it to be showing. So instead of putting this all the way at the bottom, what I'm going to do is actually put this a little bit higher in the function, a little bit closer to the event.prevent default. And I'm doing this because we want this to happen very quickly. Our story is very small. We don't really have a lot of logic in here, but we don't want there to be too much of a flash on the page after we add the story at the bottom and then remove something from the top. It'll look like the page is bouncing around a little bit. So what we're going to do is the exact opposite of what we did with the class list for the story section, and we are going to say madlibs.classlist.add, and then we are going to add the hide class to its class list. So if we head back over to the browser again, some very exciting stuff is happening this time. Once we complete the form, we are taken from our Mad Libs form and we now see only our completed story and our header. And that is so awesome. We are 99% of the way there. You guys have been doing so awesome this far. So now that we have our completed story, I am just going to style it a little bit to make it blend in a little bit more. So I'm going to head over to our madlibs.css and I am going to target the completed story section. And to this section, I am going to give it a little bit of padding, some margin. I want the text in this section to be centered. I am going to increase the font size as well as the line height as well. Then what I want to do is style the inserted text so that our users can see the words that they input and contributed to the story. So for this, I'm making it a little bit extra so it can stand out. So I'm giving it a border with a really pretty blue. I am making the font weight 700, which is a bold. I am changing the background color of it, and I am also giving these words a little bit of padding and margin so they have a little bit more space on the page as well. So what happens when the user has completed their story and they potentially want to create the story again? Well, technically they could just go ahead and hit the refresh button on the browser, which would reset the game for them, but I think that we could make things a little bit easier and improve our user experience by creating a play again button. So instead of having a generate button like we do on the Mad Libs form, what we can do is toggle that generate button for a play again button. There are a few different ways to do this, but let's do it using a pattern that we have already been using. So over in our madlibs.js, submit Mad Libs function, all the way at the bottom, what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called reset button. And what we're going to do in this variable is store an HTML element. So just like you would in HTML, what we're going to do is create and wire up a button. So this button should have an ID, and we also want it to have a function, and it should be an on-click function. That way, when the user clicks this button, we can reset the Mad Libs form for them. And instead of having the generate text, let's go ahead and change this to play again. After we've already created our button, what we're going to do is similar to what we've done above in this function, which is add it or append it to our story section. So what we're going to do is use story.section.innerHTML, and again, we're just going to add this button element onto the inner HTML of our completed story section. So when we created this button, we gave it a function, so now let's wire up that function. So outside of the submit Mad Libs function, we're going to create a new function, and it has to be named the same thing that we gave it in the button, so I'm going to call it reset Mad Libs. And we have 4 main things that we need to do in this function. The first thing is we need to hide the story section. If we're resetting, that means that the player wants to play again, which means that we have to show the form. The second thing we need to do is to reset the completed story data. We don't want our old story data getting mingled in with the new story data, so it's just easiest to go ahead and set this to an empty string. And what we're going to do is basically reset this section to what it was initially when we started, which is just empty. So we're going to use story_section.innerHTML, and we're just going to set that to an empty string. Then we want to reset the input fields within the form. And luckily, since JavaScript recognizes that our Mad Libs form element that we are storing is an HTML form, we can use the reset function on it, and that is basically going to clear out all of the inputs that the user had on it before. And then we want to actually show that form. So currently, in the state that it's in, this Mad Libs form has the class of hide because we didn't want to show it when we were showing the completed story. But now we have already hidden the completed story, and now we want to show the form. So we're going to use the classlist.remove hide, and that is going to allow us to see the form again. So let's go ahead and see this in action. Let's head over to the browser and see what we can see. Go ahead and enter your input for what feels like the 1 millionth time probably. And what you should see when you hit the generate button is you have your story. We love that. But now you should also see a play again button. And when you hit the play again button, what should happen is you should be taken back to the original Mad Libs form, and it shouldn't have any data in it. So now that we have our functionality and all of our inputs out, it is time to finish up and do a little bit of just miscellaneous styling. So the first one I want to tackle is our buttons because they are sticking out like a sore thumb, almost like the header right now, but we're going to go ahead and tackle the buttons first. So what I want to do is I want to make this like a pill-shaped button. So I'm going to give it a little bit more height, and I'm going to give it a lot more width. And from there, I'm going to add a border radius, a background, and some padding as well. And then, of course, I have given just about everything a shadow so far, so this button is not exempt. But then I also want to make the text stand out a little bit as well, so I'm going to transform the text to be in all uppercase, and then I am also going to change the font weight to 700 so that it's bold. So the final thing that we're going to do before we just run through it one more time is fix our header, because it has been bothering me for quite a while. So we are going to just target our H1, H2, and H3 and give it a margin of 0. Then I am targeting an ID that technically isn't in our HTML yet, but we're going to update our HTML in just a second and give it a little bit of padding. And then I have created a .censor class. You can also add this to the section where you are targeting your intro as well. It's all up to you. It's all about preference. But once we do this, we have to head over to our madlibs.html one last time, and we are going to update our header. We are going to give it the ID of intro, just like we defined a few seconds ago, and give it that class of center. And now it is time to see all of our work come into action. So, the first thing that you should notice is everything looks a lot better now once all of the headers are centered, but I'm going to go ahead and run through and just do my inputs one last time and just do one last check and make sure everything works, and it looks like it does. This is such a fun project, and I'm really excited and happy that you have allowed me to create it with you today. Okay, so now we can take a little bit of a breather. You finished. You created a Mad Libs app. How do you feel? Did you like creating the project? Was it fun? And will you be creating one with your own story for your friends and family to complete? I would love to know what you thought about this video in the comments below. So thank you all so very much for watching. I hope that this tutorial was insightful and very helpful, or even just something fun to do. If you guys like this video, please feel free to like and subscribe to my channel. And if you subscribe, be sure to turn on the notifications to be notified every single time I post a video. And until then, I can't wait to see you all in my next video.